Oh.
Greetings, my name is Sturden and I talk about the lore and history of several games and other things I like. Now, as a proper connoisseur of fantasy franchises that start with the word war, it probably is not much of a surprise to learn that I'm a pretty big fan of World of Warcraft as well. Ever since I made my first character, it has captured my heart in more ways than I could possibly put into words. And despite the ups and downs it has had over the years, I've still held it in a place very near and dear to my heart. And luckily for someone who likes to talk as much as I do, it also has a whole bunch of lore and stories to talk about. Some of which are good and evoke an emotional reaction, some of which are not and only evoke everlasting pain and suffering upon the innocent. Though fear not, as this first dive into Warcraft lore, I've picked out a story that is not nearly as backward stupid as others are, for the most part, partially inspired by Hearthstone's latest Voyage to the Sunken City expansion, partially just because it's a story and character who I like quite a bit. Today I will tell you about the glorious tale of Queen Azshara and the Naga. A lot of stupidity and dumb jokes ahead, you have been warned. So, once upon a time, back in ye olden days, there was this small little funny planet known as Azeroth. The weather wasn't too bad, lots of beautiful natural vistas, the house market was pretty stable, overall a pretty alright place to live by all accounts. Well, that is, minus the 4 Lovecraftian deities squatting there and ruling the place. These 4 friendly fellows that totally won't be important later on, promise, had a pretty good little thing going known as the very lovely and friendly named Black Empire, where they would spend their days pulling silly pranks on each other like spreading madness and death across the land and waging all-out war. What a bunch of rascals. I do wonder what sort of hilarious mischief they'll run into next. Well, so one day, some intergalactic folks known as the Titans showed up, looked at the sheer tomfoolery going on in Azeroth, and they weren't having any of it. They decided to squash these goofy jokers, and promptly began putting together armies of constructs to give them a good slap on the wrist and teach them to play nice. But 4 ginormous Lovecraftian beasties aren't exactly defenseless, and they procured their army of bugs to put a stop to the Titans, wanting to put a stop to them. So they fought for a while and had a pretty alright time of it. Until one day the gears in the Titans' heads started turning and they realized that, hey, we are like the size of planets and stuff. These clowns aren't. Can't we just do something about them ourselves? So, in all their intergalactic wisdom, they decided to reach down and pick up the most bothersome one with the crappiest name and pull it out like an evil, oversized splinter with tentacles. Now here's a Lovecraftian deity fun tip. These species are pretty large. Some may even say they are quite massive. And they tend to be embedded and rooted into the world, and pretty deep at that. Ever seen someone put out a massive tree or plant and have a big chunk of the dirt come loose with it? Yes, it turns out that pulling this goofball out wasn't exactly the brightest idea in the world, and in doing so, they also ripped out a part of the planet and uncontrolled magical energies began pouring out of the wound. Kinda crossed that idea off the list, so the Titans decided to put the other old gods in detention instead of destroying them as well, fearing that the planet would crack like an egg if they pulled all of them out at once. So the Titans locked them up in 100% foolproof prisons from which they would never break out, promise, and they promptly pissed off to get cigarettes and buy milk or something, and they weren't seen for like a trillion years after that. Now skip forward like a trillion years in the slightly less olden days, and remember that giant fuck-off wound in the planet out of which spilled all sorts of magical powers of infinite potential? Well, a place like that hardly goes unnoticed, and a group of elves live there now. Today's variety of pointy-eared weirdos are known as the Night Elves, or Kaldorai, or Children of the Moon, or whatever other pretentious name you can come up with. And as can be imagined from living on top of a giant well of magical energies and infinite potential, they were crazy good at magic and used it to do all sorts of funky stuff. But outside of the typical elven traits like good at magic, basically immortal and a bit of a prick, they also had another interesting trait: classism. Which made them pretty big pricks, actually. So basically, the elves that lived on top of this giant well of magical energies and let's just call it the Well of Eternity, because that was its name, were known as the very subtly named Highborn, and made up the higher castes of society since they were all crazy good at magic and really cool and handsome and stuff. Everyone who wasn't a Highborn or lived close enough to the Well of Eternity could, quoting Lord Xavius, eat shit, and are about on the same level as a bookshelf or particularly chatty floor mat. Enter their queen, in particular star of this show, Queen Azshara. Now, as can be imagined of someone who is the immortal queen of a bunch of snooty classist elves, Azshara is the snootiest and classistest of them all. It's helped much by the fact that she was also the most beautiful being in existence, the craziest and goodest at magic of them all, and that people wanted to kiss her ass both figuratively and literally, and showering her with praise 24/7. So Azshara and the Highborn were having a mighty fine time partying, doing crazy magic things and oppressing the underclasses, when one day she got a very particular call on her magic Skype. It was Sargeras, the Dark Titan, Lord of the Burning Legion, and basically the Warcraft equivalent of Satan if Satan was the size of a planet and wanted to destroy everything in reality ever. Now, Sargeras did his typical Satan thing of offering Azshara infinite power, limitless knowledge, a free Netflix subscription and a gift basket of exotic herbs and wine, in return for her assistance in invading Azeroth and stomping everything into a fine paste. Azshara was, surprise surprise, immediately on board with its plan. But not because of the whole infinite power and eternal wisdom shtick you see, but because Azshara really had a thing for ginormous godlike beings the size of a planet. So, as it turns out, telling an immortal being that she's perfect in every single way, having her be crazy good at magic and giving her absolute authority over a massive empire for a few thousand years dilutes their view of themselves and the world a tad. In Azshara's eyes, the only person worthy of marrying someone of her status is a literal titan of nigh infinite power. Don't ask me how she thinks that'll work, I'm pretty sure the proportions don't match up, but I'm not an immortal queen with crazy good magical powers, so what do I know? Predictably, it didn't take much convincing to get the other Highborn on their side, as they looked at their collective evil elitist jerk bingo card one day and saw that making deals with literal actual demons hadn't been crossed off yet. So it didn't take long for Azshara to gather her best sorcerers and begin summoning in a real crap ton of demons. Oh, sorry, wait, hang on, I got my lore wrong there. What I meant to say was summoning in a real fuck ton of demons. Now, as can be imagined, not everyone was exactly down with the idea of turning the entirety of Azeroth into a massive all-you-can-eat buffet for demons. And the fact that whenever the demons needed souls, blood or Pepsi, it wasn't the Highborn coughing it up and they were happily released upon the underclasses, didn't help much with public opinion either. So a group of brave heroes rose up against the snooty nobles and their army of evildoers in a brave resistance, led by legendary figures like Tyrande Whisperwind, her druid boy toy Malfurion, and the most amazing being to ever live, Illidan, what a guy, as well as some other characters that don't matter and will never be important to the lore ever, promise. Oh, and also an orc, despite orcs not entering Azeroth until about 10,000 years later, and it's confusing, don't worry about it. Now, this brave group of scrappy underdogs, aided by a bazillion demigods, dragons and spirits of nature, not much of an underclass anymore now is it, promptly began kicking in the shins of the demons and their evil highborn cousins in a massive cluster cluck known as the War of the Ancients. Now, this is among the most important and influential events in Warcraft lore, with incredibly important events, involving equally important characters, which is exactly why I'm not going to cover any of it. TLDR, with a fair bit of shenanigans on the side involving our boy Illidan, they eventually managed to kick the Highborn's finely shaped pristine asses and push the demons back from whence they came, though this only caused Azshara and the remaining Highborn to double down on summoning demons from the Well of Eternity even harder and go even crazier with their magics in their efforts to salvage a lost situation. Now here's a well of infinite arcane energies and magic potential fun fact. Don't go too crazy with it, ever. The more you poke the magic beehive, the more unstable it becomes. Arcane energies aren't your friends. They're just as prone as acting against you as they are to serving you. It might take a while, but if you get careless, you'll be drowned in a tide of angry buzzing and stings eventually. A lesson the Highborn clearly didn't learn in time, as before long, the Well of Eternity, growing a teensy bit volatile after using it to summon like a gazillion demons, imploded and caused an absolutely ginormous amount of damage. And when I say ginormous amount of damage, I mean as in cracked the supercontinent of Kalimdor into pieces like a cookie in sulfuric acid. Stuff got rocked. An untold amount of people died, cities were torn to pieces, entire civilizations were buried, and it was a not so good time for everyone involved. Now, as might be imagined, Azshara and the Nightborn, basically living right on top of the Well of Eternity, didn't have a good time of it either. The entire Night Elven capital of Zinashari was promptly drowned in a massive tidal wave of pure, concentrated karma. And not even being crazy good at magic is enough to stop several million cubic miles of water crashing down on you all at once. It was while being drowned in the waters of karma that Queen Azshara was probably rethinking her life's choices a tad. Or at least she did, until a voice whispered to her in darkness. It was the charming, smooth, buttery voice of N'Zoth, one of those Lovecraftian rascals from the very beginning. So N'Zoth had been a pretty big fan of Azshara and her way of running things, and was basically like, look, you got potential. You're beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and crazy good at magic. You're a real queen, girl. However, you also need oxygen, and there isn't much of that around here, so how about you work for me and I'll see what I can do about that. To which Azshara responded, somehow, despite not being able to breathe and probably wanting to conserve what little oxygen she had left, cool story, not going to happen. I'm Queen motherfucking Azshara. I'm not going to become some nameless, mindless minion or a random quest mob. I'm a ruler, a queen. So unless you have a better offer, could you please piss off and let me drown in peace? Thanks. To which N'Zoth went, and that's why I like you. You got yourself a deal. And saved Azshara and the other evil snooty highborn by transforming them into the Naga. Fish snake people with insane crazy good magic powers, who are now additionally souped up by an old god. Good thing too, because they had almost learned an important lesson there, but can't have that. So once dust had settled a bit, the surviving Night Elves recolonized and settled on land, while Azshara and her cronies just sort of decided to keep living where they were. Was probably a bit of a pisser to pull the seaweed out of your favorite couch, but hey, you could basically go right back to what you were doing before the almost world-ending event for which you were largely responsible. Soon enough, most parts of the ocean had at least one Naga kicking about the place, and plenty of sailors, fishermen, and other inhabitants of the coast were quickly reacquainted with their fishy cousins at the pointed end of a trident. The Naga grew their empire into a new underwater age, profiting of all the defensive benefits that being several hundred meters under the sea brings along with it, and basically doing whatever they felt like. Magical rituals, politics, a bit of underwater slavery on the side, and maybe going to the surface to mess with some landwalkers in the weekends. At least that was until one day several thousand adventurers popped out of the floor like weeds in a garden, who happily murdered thousands of the snake-tailed buggers for like 3 gold pieces and a used condom. But what about after that? Well, the Naga have played a relatively significant role in the story of WoW so far. It was Lady Vashj that teamed up with Illidan for a bit while he went on a gap year in Outland, what a swell guy, and tried to drain the entirety of Zangar Marsh's water because of reasons, probably just to be pricks. Some Naga sorceress named the Sea Witch, which is quite the pretentious name as technically any female Naga who is good at magic can be called that. 360 no-scoped Fulgin's dad that one time. They had some business in Cataclysm, but it was Cataclysm, so who knows what the hoo-ha was going on in there. And in Legion they were actively trying to obtain one of the McMuffins of creation to do something. Probably some evil magic elf stuff, or just to be pricks about it if their previous track record is anything to go by. Those were basically all their major gigs up until BFA, where Azshara finally decided to step in herself and use that McMuffin from earlier to lure in the player characters in order to trick them into releasing N'Zoth. Unfortunately for her, player characters having the destructive power of a ballistic missile that they do, massacred a couple thousand of her people as well as bonking her most powerful generals and allies back into the depths where they belong. As well as, you know, murdering her. Seems like the day is saved and her plan backfired, right? Well, kind of, as she actually still manages to release N'Zoth and set a very cranky old god free upon the world once more, who even decides to be a good lad and reanimate her. Sounds good for her, right? Well, unfortunately, being killed and having your palace be raided and set on fire doesn't exactly look great on your quarterly review. So like a proper CEO, Bezos decides to yoink Azshara into his torture pits for giggles, getting a feeling that there might have been some unresolved frustration there. However, the power of the player characters truly cannot be contained, and we break in through his bedroom window and start burning down his house as well. Unfortunately for N'Zoth, he was actually keeping Azshara locked up in the toilet, so we release her and she basically tells us that she never really liked working for N'Zoth anyway, and asks us to hand over her resignation to him for her. And with resignation I mean a big spooky knife, and with hand in I mean shank in between the ribs. They don't play around in highborn society. After this, she quickly and rightfully decides to bugger off before she's unwillingly turned into a loot piñata again, and that's the last we've seen of her for now. Can't keep an absolute monarch like her down forever, and I got me a feeling we'll see her being up to her usual shenanigans soon enough. Seeing as how she has been systematically working her way up from working for a titan to an old god, perhaps next time she'll be shaking hands with a void god or whatever other massive power she can manage to reach on Magic Skype. Or she'll become fully independent and start setting the world on fire for giggles. Who knows? Not me, that's for sure. I'm just some random person on the internet who likes to talk too much. Now, if you're still here, thank you for watching this video. I'll basically make lore videos of whatever interests me at the moment, so if you're there for that, consider liking and subscribing. If you have a topic you'd like me to discuss, or you just want to actually me, you can let me know in the comments. My socials are in the description below, so give that a look if you'd like to see some of my hobby stuff or whatever else. I hope you spent the day hobbying or doing something that makes you happy, and bye bye. Can't keep an absolute monarch like her loike sa.